I got home 11 hours early because a client in Charlotte canceled a delivery window. And 11 hours is the difference between finding out something on your own terms and finding it out the way everybody else does, after it and oppose. Already happened after the story has already been written for you by people who had more time to write it than you had to read it. I want you to understand that before anything else. Everything that came after started because of 11 hours. It was a Tuesday, 11:40 at night, and I turned my rig onto cobblestone court the way I and oppose. D turned onto it 1,000 times in 14 years, and something in my chest went tight before my eyes had even finished processing what was wrong. Houses have a way of telling you the truth if you and oppose. V spent your life learning to read things that dawn and oppose. T want to be read, loads that ride crooked, gauges that lie by half a degree, houses that are dark in the wrong way. A sleeping house is soft dark. A porch light left on. A blue flicker behind a curtain. This was sealed dark. Nothing living in it. Except one window. The kitchen at the back, a thin gold seam under the door to the mudroom, and under it, so faint I almost mistook it for the highway behind me, the low mechanical hum of a washing machine running its spin cycle at 1:45. I sat in the cab with the engine ticking as it cooled, and I made myself breathe the way you breathe before you open a trailer door you already suspect is going to show you something you can and oppose. TNC. Then I got out, walked around the side of the house instead of the front, because some instinct in me, the instinct of 31 years hauling freight through the dark half of this country, told me not to walk in through the door where I was expected. He was folding towels. My son, 16 years old, standing at the mudroom counter in sweatpants and a t-shirt gone gray with washing. His shoulders curved forward the specific way a person and oppose. S shoulders curve when they and oppose. V been standing in one place doing one task for a very long time. There was a laundry basket at his feet stacked higher than his waist. His hands moved fast, practiced, the motion of someone who does this so often his hands have stopped needing his attention. End quote, Eli. End quote. He spun so hard he knocked the whole stack sideways. For one unguarded second, before anything else arranged itself on his face, I saw pure relief. The kind of relief that comes only after a person has stopped expecting rescue and then gets it anyway. And right behind the relief, so fast I almost missed it, came something that looked exactly like fear. End quote, Mom. End quote, his voice cracked upward. End quote, you and oppose, not, you wearin' and oppose, T supposed to be home till morning. End quote. End quote, Charlotte fell through. End quote, I kept my voice level the way I keep a rig level on ice. No sudden inputs, no oversteering. End quote, where is everybody? End quote. He bent down and started refolding the towels that had fallen, not looking at me. End quote, they went to the lake house. Left Sunday, end quote. End quote, left you here. End quote. End quote, I had school. End quote. He said it like a fact that explained itself the way you and oppose. D explain why the sun sets. End quote, it and oppose. S 11:40 at night, baby. Why are you doing laundry at 11:40 at night? End quote. He shrugged with one shoulder, David and oppose. S shrug, the one our son had inherited without ever meeting the man who and oppose. D invented it because some things pass down through blood whether or not they're and oppose. S time to teach them. End quote. I like to get it done before everyone and oppose. S up, end quote, he said. End quote. Fewer people in the way, end quote. I looked at him. Really looked the way you dawn and oppose. T let yourself look when looking would require you to act on what you see. He was thin. Not teenage growth spurt thin, the other kind, the kind where a wrist looks like something you could close two fingers around. There were faint yellow-green marks along his forearm, old bruises healing out, and when he reached up to push his hair back, his sleeve rode up enough for me to see two more, darker, newer, blooming along his bicep like something had gripped him there and held on. End quote, who did that, end quote, I said. It wasn't an oppose, T a question. My voice had gone somewhere flat and very far away from the rest of me. End quote, I fell. Skateboarding, end quote. He said it too fast, the words arriving before I and oppose. D finished asking, which told me more than the bruises did. End quote, Eli, end quote. End quote, I and oppose am fine, Mom. I and oppose, V got this handled. End quote, he picked the basket back up like the conversation was over, like handling it was a thing a person could simply decide to do and then it was done. I did not press him further that night. I want to be honest about that because honesty is the only thing I have left to offer anyone about what happened in my house, and because I think the parts where I got it wrong matter as much as the parts where I finally got it right. I told him to go to bed. I told him I and Appos, D finished the laundry. And I stood at that counter at midnight folding towels my son had been folding alone, and I let the shape of what I was looking at start assembling itself in the dark, piece by piece, the way you assemble a highway accident afterward from skid marks nobody was there to explain. I found the note on the refrigerator, held under a magnet shaped like a sunflower I and Appos. D bought at a farmer's market the first spring after David died. 3 lines in Priscilla and Appos' handwriting. Lake House through Sunday. Eli didn't and Appos T want to come. Cash in the coffee tin if he needs anything. No call if anything comes up. No mention that a 16-year-old had been left alone in a house for 4 nights like a plant you trust to water itself. Just cash in the tin. Instructions for something that didn't and Appos T need a person and Appos' judgment involved. I folded that note along its crease with hands that were not steady and I put it in my jacket pocket. And I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets and I stayed there until the dryer buzzer went off at 1 in the morning. And something in my chest had gone from tight to cold and very, very deliberate. I didn't and Appos T know yet how much I didn't and Appos T know. But I knew enough to understand that the woman who wrote cash in the coffee tin was not a woman who had simply forgotten to plan better. She was a woman who had planned exactly this. To understand how I ended up sitting on that kitchen floor at 1 in the morning, you need to go back to a Piggly Wiggly in Bowman, South Carolina in the June of 1994, because that is where my whole life actually starts even though I didn't and Appos T know it at the time. My name is Renata Cole. Everybody and Appos called me Rena since I was small enough that Renata took too long to say. I and Appos am 54 years old. I and Appos been driving long haul since I was 23, mostly the Eastern Corridor, I-95 from Maine down through Florida and back, the kind of route that will teach a person more about this country than 4 years of anything you could pay tuition for. I grew up outside of Sumter with a father who left when I was 6 and a mother who cleaned houses for people who called her by her first name and expected her to call them by Mrs. I quit school at 16 to help with the bills. I and Appos am not telling you that so you and Appos LL feel sorry for me. I and Appos am telling you because it and Appos the first thing you need to understand about who I am. I have never once in my life expected anything to be handed to me, and I have built a habit out of checking the manifest myself before I sign for the load. I was 22 working the register-adjacent job of loading trucks for a regional grocery distributor, elbow deep in learning a trade nobody had offered to teach me for free, when I walked into that Piggly Wiggly on a Thursday to grab something for dinner, and got in line behind a man with motor oil worked so deep into the creases of his knuckles it looked like a tattoo. And quote, you and Appos, we got grease past your wrists and quote, I told him because I and Appos, we never in my life kept an observation to myself when I had one worth making. End quote. Occupational hazard, end quote, he said. End quote. What and Appos, the occupation. End quote. End quote, depends which day you ask. Today it and Appos. The guy hoping you tell him your name before you finish ringing up his groceries. End quote. I did smile at that, though I made him wait for it. End quote. Priscilla and Appos watching, end quote. I said, nodding at my manager 2 registers down. End quote. Focus. End quote. End quote. David, end quote, he said. End quote. David Cole. End quote. End quote. Rena, end quote, I told him. And then because some part of me already knew, even standing there under fluorescent lights with a scanner beeping between us. End quote. You and Appos, we got grease on your collar too. You should look in a mirror before you come courting a girl at her register. End quote. End quote. Wasn't and Appos T planning on courting anybody today, end quote, he said. End quote. But I and Appos am flexible. End quote. Our first date was black coffee and a slice of pecan pie at a diner off Highway 15, because neither one of us had money for anything fancier and neither one of us pretended otherwise. He talked about wanting to get his CDL, the big rigs, the kind of freight that could actually support a family instead of just a person. I talked about the 2-year accounting certificate I was working toward at night after my shifts, the ledger I kept in a spiral notebook of every dollar I and Appos D saved since I was 14, the exact number I needed before I and Appos D feel like a person standing on solid ground instead of borrowed ground. End quote. That and oppose. Is specific number end quote, he said. End quote. I don and oppose. T believe in vague plans end quote, I told him. End quote. Vague plans are how people end up living lives that happen to them instead of lives they built. End quote. He looked at me for a long moment over his coffee cup. End quote. I think you might be the most deliberate person I and oppose ever met. End quote. End quote. Somebody has to be end quote, I said. End quote. The world and oppose. Mostly run by people improvising, end quote. We got married in 1996 at the Sumter County Courthouse with his brother Marcus standing witness and a Waffle House hash brown platter for our reception, because we and oppose. D agreed, the night we got engaged, sitting on the hood of his truck in a parking lot, that we would not have children until we had built something worth bringing a child into. Not because we didn't and oppose. T want them. God, we wanted them. But we had both grown up in houses that belonged to somebody else and oppose. Decisions, and we were not going to hand a child a life we hadn't and oppose. T finished building the floor of first. Took us 9 years. 9 years of my accounting work in his long halls, of a house we bought with cash instead of a mortgage because I refused to owe a bank a single cent of interest on the only thing either of us had ever truly owned. 9 years and 2 losses that I am not going to describe in detail here because they are mine and David and oppose. And they don and oppose. T belong to anybody else and oppose. Story, not even in the telling of it. I will say only that on the night we decided to try one final time, David sat on the floor of our bedroom next to where I lay curled with my back to him, and he didn't and oppose. T touched me and he didn't and oppose. T tell me it would be fine because we had both learned by then that fine was not a promise either of us had the right to make. He just talked about a truck stop outside Roanoke with pie that tasted like his grandmother and oppose. About a sunrise over the Blue Ridge that had turned the whole sky the color of a peach. He talked until I fell asleep to the sound of his voice instead of the sound of my own fear. And in the morning I told him I wanted to try again. Eli David Cole was born on a Sunday in April, 7 pounds 2 ounces, and screaming with an outrage that suggested he had strong personal opinions about having been kept waiting 9 years. I did not cry in that delivery room because I don and oppose. T as a rule, but David did, hard enough that the nurse offered him a chair. End quote. I and oppose. Am not the one who just gave birth end quote. He told her, wiping his face with the back of his wrist end quote. And I still might need to sit down end quote. For 12 years we were exactly the family we had promised each other we would build. David drove, I kept the books for 3 small businesses out of our spare room and raised our son on a schedule that ran like a train timetable, and every single night David was on the road, he called at 8:00 and oppose, clock sharp, and every single morning I stood at the kitchen window and watched him pull out of the driveway and wave from the porch until his truck disappeared around the bend of Cobblestone Court. Then in the winter Eli turned 12, David started getting tired in a way that wasn't an oppose. T about miles on the road. 6 months later we had a diagnosis nobody wants to hear the name of twice, and 18 months after that, on a gray Thursday morning with the window light coming in soft, David Cole died with Eli on one side of the bed and me on the other, and our son held his father and oppose's hand and did not look away not once, and I have never in my life been prouder of anyone. 2 weeks before he died, David asked me to bring him his father and oppose's compass, an old brass field compass dented on one side, that had come down through 3 generations of Cole men and that he and oppose carried in his jacket pocket on every run for 20 years, the way some men carry a rosary. He pressed it into my palm instead of Eli and oppose's. End quote. Give this to him when he and oppose's ready end quote, he said. End quote, not yet. He and oppose's not ready yet. You and oppose, LL no. End quote. End quote. I and oppose, LL no end quote, I promised. End quote. Tell him end quote, David said, and his voice by then was barely more than breath end quote. Tell him a compass doesn't and oppose tell you where to go. It just tells you the truth about where you and oppose standing. That and oppose all he and oppose I'll ever need from it. End quote. I put that compass in my jewelry box the day after the funeral, and I checked on it more times in the first year than I and oppose am willing to admit, just to know it was still there, still waiting for my son the way I was still waiting to know how to be a person again. Grief, if nobody has told you this yet, is not a wound that closes. It and oppose A permanent redistribution of weight. You learn to carry it and eventually you stop noticing the carrying the way you stop noticing the weight of your own arms, until one day somebody offers to help you carry something, and you realize how tired you and Appo's actually been the whole time. I went back on the road 8 weeks after the funeral because the bills required it and because sitting in that house with all of David and Appo's things and none of David in them felt like breathing air that had been replaced with something that looked like air but wasn't. And Appo's on the road, the job was simple. Load, drive, deliver sign. Nobody expected me to be anything other than a driver. I met Victor Marsh at a Rotary Club auction in Sumter in the spring of 2022, 10 months after David died. I almost didn't in Appo's go. I went because Priscilla, my old grocery store manager who and Appo's become one of the only people I still let close enough to nag me, told me if I sat in that house alone one more Saturday night she was going to drive over and drag me out by my collar herself. He found me at the drinks table. Mid-40s, the kind of put together that reads as effortless when it is, in fact, the opposite of effortless. He looked at my hands before he looked at my face. The calluses, the grease shadow permanently worked into the pad of my thumb, the way most people look somewhere else first when they and Appo's redeciding what to make of you. End quote, you drive, end quote, he said. Not a question. End quote, long haul, end quote, I said. End quote, 14 years. End quote. End quote, my mother and Appo's brother drove out of Memphis for 2 decades. Said there and Appo's no better education on earth. You see the whole country and Appo's insides from up in that cab. What people are hiding, what they can and Appo's hide. End quote. End quote, he wasn't and Appo's wrong, end quote, I said. End quote, what do you see? End quote. He asked, and he asked it like the answer genuinely mattered to him, leaning in slightly, giving me the specific undivided attention that a lonely person will later remember as the moment they were seen. I talked to him for 20 minutes. I drove home telling myself that and Appo's a man who pays attention. I was right about the paying attention. I was wrong, completely wrong about why. The second time I ran into him was at a chamber breakfast 6 weeks later, and he had a coffee waiting for me before I and Appo's reached the carafe myself. Black, no sugar. End quote, you remembered, end quote, I said. End quote, I pay attention to people, end quote, he said. End quote, it and Appo's a habit. End quote. I thought it was generosity. I thought, God help me. I thought about David saying I notice everything was a compliment Claire-shaped women got to receive, and I let myself feel a small disloyal gratitude that someone in the world still noticed things about me specifically. That is the exact shape loneliness takes when it in Appo's working on you. It doesn't in Appo's announce itself as loneliness. It just quietly lowers the gate you didn't in Appo's realize you and Appo's built. I told Eli about him in the fall. My son was 14, hunched over algebra homework at the kitchen table, and he didn't and Appo's look up when I mentioned Victor and Appo's name. End quote, he seems nice, end quote, Eli said. End quote, you think so or you know so? End quote. He finally looked up at me, and there was something old in his face for a 14-year-old, something that should have told me more than it did. End quote, I don't and Appo's know him, end quote, he said. End quote, I know you and Appo's happier when he calls. I guess that and Appo's something. End quote. I let that be enough. I told myself teenagers are naturally wary of anyone who might replace a parent, that this was ordinary and expected and would soften with time. I was reading the wrong signals for the wrong reasons, and I would keep reading them wrong for 18 more months because I needed, more than I needed almost anything else, to believe the universe had decided to be kind to me for once. What I did not know, what I would not learn until much later, sitting in the dark cab of my rig with a black ledger open in my lap, was that Victor Marsh had not found me at that drinks table by accident. His mother, Pauline, had identified me 14 months earlier, 2 months after David and Appo's funeral, from an obituary notice and a property record search. A widow with a paid-off house, a stable trucking income, a preteen son, and Pauline and Appo's word for it, written in her own hand in a notebook I would not find for another 2 years, isolated. I had not been a woman a good man happened to fall in love with at a charity auction. I had been a line item on a list. We married in the spring of 2023. Small ceremony, my brother-in-law Marcus and his wife drove up from Charleston. Priscilla came in her good church dress. A handful of drivers from the depot in shirts that still smelled faintly of diesel no matter how many times they and Oppos been washed. Eli stood beside me in a borrowed tie and shook Victor and Oppos' hand at the reception like he was completing a transaction he had and Oppos' signed off on. I should have paid more attention to that handshake. I filed it instead under teenagers adjust slowly and I went back to my life. 3 weeks after the wedding, Victor came to me on a Sunday evening with a soft voice and a completely reasonable-sounding request. And quote, Mom and Oppos' lease is coming up and her hip and Oppos' been giving her trouble on stairs. Just for a few months while she finds something on one level. End quote. End quote. How many months are we talking? End quote. End quote 3. Maybe 4. End quote. He put his hand over mine on the table. End quote. She and Oppos' family now too, Rena. End quote. I thought about the 4-bedroom house David and I had built with cash, 2 rooms sitting empty since Eli had grown too old to need a playroom and I had never found the will to fill the other with anything but boxes of David and Oppos' things I couldn't and Oppos' bear to sort. I said yes. Pauline arrived with a rented U-Haul the following week. Her daughter Denise came 10 days after that and quote, just temporarily while her lease sorts itself out end quote. Denise and Oppos' son Tyler, 15, a year younger than Eli, came with her because Denise explained it made more sense for him to be wherever she was. Just like that, a household of 2 became a household of 6. The first 2 weeks were, I will admit, honestly wonderful in a way that disarmed every instinct I should have trusted. Pauline cooked every night. Real meals, the kind I hadn't and Oppos' had energy to make consistently since David died. She asked about my routes, whether I preferred my coffee in a mug or a travel cup for 4 a.m. departures, whether my knee I and Oppos' mentioned once in passing an old injury, was giving me trouble on cold mornings. End quote. You work too hard for a woman your age end quote. She told me one evening, setting a plate down in front of me with both hands ceremonial like an offering. End quote. Out on that road all alone. You need people looking after you. End quote. End quote. I manage fine end quote, I said. End quote. Of course you do. End quote. She smiled, warm, patient, a temperature that had clearly been calibrated over years for maximum effect. End quote. But fine SN and Oppos' the same as cared for, is it? End quote. I ate every bite and told her it was the best meal I and Oppos' had in a year. She beamed like I and Oppos' handed her something she and Oppos' been waiting for. I did not understand then that she was filing every word I said, every preference, every soft place, every spot on the map where a tired woman could be managed if you knew precisely where to press. I need to tell you about the first time Eli tried to tell me because I got it wrong, and getting it wrong is the part of this story I've had to sit with the longest. It was late October, 6 months after the household expanded to 6. I was home for a rare 4-day stretch, and Eli came into the kitchen while I was going over my logbook at the table, and sat down across from me with the particular stillness of someone who has rehearsed an opening line and is now terrified to use it. End quote. Mom, can I tell you something and you actually just listen? Not fix it right away. Just listen first. End quote. End quote. Of course, baby. End quote. End quote. Grandma Pauline. End quote. He still called her that then, still trying to make the new arrangement work the way I and Oppos' asked him to. End quote. She makes me redo stuff. Like a lot. I mop the kitchen and she says it and Oppos' not clean and makes me do it again. 3 times sometimes. End quote. I remember exactly what I did with that sentence. I remember it because I have replayed it more times than I can count. I laughed. Not unkindly, I told myself at the time, just easily. The laugh of a mother trying to lighten a moment that seemed like ordinary teenage friction. End quote. She and Oppos' old school end quote, I said. End quote. My grandmother made me remop a floor until you could see your reflection in it. It and Oppos' a generational thing, not a character flaw. End quote. End quote. It and Oppos' not just the floor end quote, Eli said, and something in his voice went quieter. End quote. She stands there and watches. She talks about me like I and Oppos' am not in the room. Like I and Oppos' am I Don and Oppos' Tino. A machine that and Oppos' not working right. And quote. And quote, I and Oppos. I'll talk to her and quote, I said and I meant to. I want that on the record, I meant to. But Victor came in from the garage right then with a question about the truck and Oppos' registration renewal, and the moment folded itself up and put itself away, the way moments do in a busy house, and I told myself I and Oppos' circle back to it, and I let 3 weeks go by before I circled back to anything, and by the time I did, Eli had already learned the lesson that would cost him the next 14 months of his life. That telling me things did not reliably change anything, and that the safer strategy was silence. That is the piece of this story I will never fully forgive myself for. Not that I was deceived, deception when it and Oppos' this practice, this deliberate, can catch anyone. What I can and Oppos' forgive is that my son handed me a true thing, plainly, without exaggeration, and I was too tired and too grateful for an easy household to give it the weight it deserved. Here is what I know now, pieced together from bank statements, from a black notebook, from 41 photographs an elderly neighbor took through her kitchen window, and most of all from my son, who told me everything eventually in pieces over the course of many nights, the way you carefully take apart something that and Oppos' been welded shut under pressure for too long. They ran the house on a rotation, and the rotation had a logic to it that still makes my stomach turn when I think about how deliberate it was. This was not a family losing its temper. This was a system. Pauline handled standards. Every morning before school she and Oppos' walked the downstairs rooms and find something Eli had done wrong. A floor mopped at 4:30 in the morning that somehow wasn't and Oppos' clean enough, a counter that and quote, still had a film on it and quote, she and Oppos' make him redo it while she watched, narrating to Denise as though Eli Warren and Oppos' 3 feet away. He doesn't and Oppos' know how to wring a mop properly. Somebody should have taught this boy to do things right. Denise handled the outside world. She told at least 4 neighbors over the fence in the produce aisle at the elementary school pickup line where she volunteered, that Eli had and quote, some real anger issues and quote, that she was and quote, worried about him honestly and quote, that she hated to say anything because I was so protective of my boy. None of it was true. All of it stuck, the way a rumor sticks whether or not it and Oppos' earned. I would later find out that this was the reason 2 neighbors had started crossing the street rather than saying hello to my own son. Victor handled the quiet erosion. At breakfast, which Eli cooked and then ate standing at the counter because and quote, the table and Oppos' for family and quote, a rule that appeared out of nowhere in month 3 and that I never once heard spoken aloud until Eli told me about it 18 months later. Victor would talk, just loud enough to carry into the kitchen. Your mom and Oppos' always on that road. You ever wonder why she doesn't and Oppos' find a way home more? And when Eli argued the first few times before he learned arguing didn't and Oppos' work, Victor would smile like he was agreeing with him. Sure. Long haul pays good money. Nothing wrong with a woman who prioritizes her income. And quote, she and Oppos' not prioritizing and quote, Eli would say. And quote, and Oppos', course not and quote, Victor would say in a tone that meant the opposite. And quote, I and Oppos' am sure she thinks about you every mile. And quote. Eli stopped arguing eventually. He told me much later that it was like trying to put out a fire by explaining to it why fire was wrong. The fire didn't and Oppos' care about your reasoning. Just kept burning. And then there was Tyler. Tyler was 15 and had been raised inside this operation the way some children are raised inside a family trade. He knew the vocabulary before he knew what most of it cost. He used it with the easy fluency of someone who had never known anything else. One Saturday, Eli spent the whole afternoon fixing Tyler and Oppos' bicycle. The chain had jumped its housing, the brake needed adjusting, the whole thing needed degreasing and oiling, because Eli has always been, since he was small, a boy who fixes things without being asked. When it was done, Tyler rode it down the driveway grinning, came back, said and quote, thanks and quote, in a voice that sounded for about 10 minutes completely real. The next morning, Tyler carried the bike out to the driveway and slammed it onto the concrete. Twice. The front wheel folded. The chain snapped clean off. He looked at Eli and said and quote, your fixed job was garbage, it broke itself and quote, and Eli told me his hands went so tight around the porch railing that his knuckles ached for an hour after. But here is the piece of Tyler and Oppos' story that I would not learn until much later, and that changed how I understood him entirely. Eli told me, carefully like handing over something fragile, that a few weeks after the bike, he and Oppos D found Tyler alone in the garage late one night, sitting on an overturned bucket, not doing anything, just sitting. Tyler had looked up at him and said, quiet, almost too quiet to hear, and quote, Grandma made my mom cry last week for buying the wrong brand of coffee. Made her write it down so she wouldn't and Oppos T forget again, and quote. And then before Eli could say anything back, Tyler had stood up and walked past him into the house and never mentioned it again. I Don and Oppos T say this to excuse what Tyler did to my son. I Don and Oppos T think forgiveness is mine to extend on Eli and Oppos S behalf, and I Haven and Oppos T asked him to extend it either. But I have come to believe there is a real difference between cruelty a person invents and cruelty a person is handed before they and Oppos old enough to know they had a choice about picking it up. 15 is young enough, I have to believe, for a taught thing to still be untaught. There is one more piece I have to tell you because it is the moment I came closest to seeing the truth before the night I finally saw it, and it is also the moment that shows you exactly how good Pauline was at her work. It was a Tuesday in February, and I was at a truck stop outside Florence when my phone lit up with a 12-second video from Victor. Eli in the backyard, shoving Tyler hard enough that Tyler stumbled into the chain-link fence and went down on one knee, clutching his arm. My coffee went cold in my hand. I called immediately. And quote, he and Oppos S shaken up, but he and Oppos S fine, and quote, Victor said before I and Oppos D even asked. And quote, Rena this is and Oppos T the first time. We and Oppos V been trying to handle it quietly so you wouldn't and Oppos T worry on the road, but end quote, put Eli on. End quote. A pause, and then my son and Oppos S voice, flat and careful in a way that should have told me more than it did. End quote. Hey mom. End quote. What happened? End quote. A silence that went on long enough to hurt. End quote. I pushed him, end quote. He finally said. End quote. That is not how your father and I raised you, end quote. End quote. I know, end quote, he said. Flat. Quiet. The voice of someone who has already heard the verdict and is simply waiting to be told the sentence. I drove 12 hours straight to get home 2 days later. I want that on the record too, because I did not ignore this, I acted on it just on the wrong information. And I sat my son down at the kitchen table with all the seriousness the moment seemed to deserve. End quote. Tell me what happened, end quote, I said. End quote. It won and Oppos T matter what I say. End quote. It matters to me. End quote. He looked at me for a long moment, and what I read on his face at the time was guilt. What I understand now looking back was something closer to exhaustion, the particular exhaustion of a person testing, one more time, whether this conversation might go differently than all the others, and already suspecting it wouldn't and Oppos T. End quote. Okay, end quote, he said. And then he said nothing else because he had already learned, this is the part one will carry the rest of my life, that talking to me didn't and Oppos T changed the outcome. Not when the other side had gotten to me first every single time, with a story that arrived polished and mine arrived late and unpolished and full of a 15-year-old and Oppos S inarticulate anger. I grounded him for 2 weeks. I made him apologize to Tyler. I told myself I was being a fair and even-handed parent. I did not ask what happened in the 60 seconds before that video started recording. I have since learned from Eli from the video itself, which I found much later and watched with my hand pressed so hard against my mouth I left a mark, that Tyler had spent those 60 seconds narrating in a sing-song voice the specific details of my last 3 phone calls home, which he should not have had access to at all, and which meant someone had been listening in. I did not think to ask the question that would have unraveled everything 11 months early. I have had to make my peace with that. I am still making my peace with that. By September, I had started taking longer routes without fully admitting to myself why. I told myself it was the money, fall freight rates were good. There was a backlog from summer that hadn't and Oppos T cleared the system yet. The real reason was something I couldn't and Oppos T say out loud even to myself. Something in that house had gone wrong in a way I didn't and Oppos T have language for, and when a person can and Oppos T name what and Oppos S wrong, she does the thing she knows how to do instead. I drove. I put miles between myself and a feeling I didn't and Oppos T have the courage yet to sit still with. In late September, Victor set a single sheet of paper on the table one evening while I was finishing dinner. End quote. What and oppose this? End quote. End quote. Power of attorney. For the finances. So I can handle things while you and oppose. Re-out bills the account if something comes up in the window and oppose. Tight. End quote. I want to be honest, I almost signed it. I had the pen in my hand. And then my phone rang, a dispatcher, an early pickup. And I set the pen down to take the call. And when I came back to the table 10 minutes later, Victor had already cleared the paper away. End quote. We and oppose. I'll do it when you and oppose. Re-back, end quote, he said, easy, unhurried. End quote. Sure, end quote, I said, and thought nothing more of it. I know now that setting that pen down was the single luckiest accident of the last 3 years of my life. The Charlotte contract came through in early October, 3 weeks of inventory work at a distribution hub. The biggest single job I and oppose. Landed all year. I loaded the truck on a Monday morning. Victor walked me out to the driveway, smiling a degree too bright. The way a fluorescent bulb flickers just before it burns all the way out. End quote. 3 weeks, end quote, I told him. End quote. Maybe less. End quote. End quote. Take your time, end quote, he said. End quote. We and oppose. I'll be perfectly fine. End quote. Over his shoulder I could see Tyler on the porch, grinning at nothing in particular. The grin of someone who has been waiting a long time for something to finally start. I thought he was just a 15-year-old glad school was in session and the house would be quieter. I know now what he was actually waiting for. I drove south with the radio low, and that particular feeling that sits at the start of a long haul. Half freedom, half loneliness, neither one ever quite winning. I found out later the front door had barely finished swinging shut behind me before everything in that house shifted into a different gear entirely. I did not know that yet. What I knew 19 days later was that a client dispute froze the Charlotte contract and sent me home 3 days early, and I turned onto Cobblestone Court at 11:40 at night and found a thin gold line of light under the mudroom door, and everything I thought I understood about my own house was about to need rebuilding from the ground up. I did not confront anyone that first night. A driver who in oppose spent 31 years hauling freight knows the difference between flooring it and burning the engine down. You do not move on a suspicion. You verify the load first. The next morning after Eli left for school, I walked him to the door myself, watched him go all the way to the end of the street before I let myself move. I got out the small spiral notebook I keep in my jacket and oppose left breast pocket on every run, the one where I log departure times and delivery windows and way station numbers, anything that might need proving later. A driver lives by what she can document. I had been signing my name to this household for 18 months without once opening the trailer myself to check the count against the paperwork. That morning I opened it. I started in the kitchen, the junk drawer, the place where things go because nobody wants to decide about them. 3 keys I didn't in oppose, recognize. A receipt from a jewelry appraiser in Colombia. Dated for months back. I own no jewelry worth appraising. I photographed it and moved on. In Pauline and Oppo's room in the back of a dresser drawer behind folded scarves, I found 4 debit cards, none in her name, none in mine or Victor and Oppo's. A small brass key on a plain ring that matched no lock I knew of in the house. In the closet, 2 suitcases tucked behind the hanging clothes. Heavier than a weekend bag had any business being. I unzipped the first on the bed. Not vacation clothes. Winter coats. Boots. Enough underwear and toiletries to last 4 to 6 months. The kind of packing a person does when she ISN and Oppos. Planning on coming home for a long while. The second suitcase had a thick, rubber-banded envelope at the bottom that felt like cash. And underneath it, a small black notebook, its cover soft and cracked from handling. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. The first page was a list. 8 names in neat columns. Age, occupation, estimated assets, marital status, family situation. My name was 5th. Renata Cole, 52. Long haul CDL, house paid outright, life insurance, verify beneficiary. Widowed 2020. 1 teenage son manageable. No close family nearby. Beside my name a small check mark and one word, active. Below it 3 more names with no check marks yet. People who hadn't and Oppos, been reached. This was not a family and Oppos, private financial planning. This was a hunting log, sitting half-packed in a suitcase in the closet of the bedroom where I slept every night I was home. I turned the page. Underlined at the top. Miriam Ostrowski, Charleston. Widowed. Assets substantial. Isolated, no local children. Promising. I closed the notebook and put it, with hands that had gone very steady in the specific way they do when a person has stopped feeling and started documenting, into my jacket pocket next to the logbook. It had been placed behind the stockpots in the low kitchen cabinet, under a folded dish towel, accessible but not visible, the specific placement of an object that needs to exist without being seen. I plugged it in and waited. When the screen lit, my throat closed so hard I had to grip the counter. 130 school notifications. 19 missed calls from my number going back weeks I hadn't and oppos. T-track because I and oppos. D been told every time that he was in quote, just busy with school Don and oppos. T worry he and oppos. I'll call you back. End quote. A text from a contact saved as Marcus school. Dude, are you okay? Haven and oppos. T seen you at lunch in like 2 months. People are asking. My son had been unreachable, to school, to friends, to me, for 2 months, and I had accepted the word fine from other people and oppos. Mouse like a woman who trusts a manifest she never opened. I went to the photo roll. One video 31 seconds shot low and steady, the angle of someone holding a phone at their hip and trying not to be seen filming. Tyler in the backyard standing over Eli and Oppo's bicycle. He picked it up. Slammed it down. Twice. The front wheel folded. At the end he looked straight into the camera and smiled. Below the video in the caption field, Eli had typed a note to himself. In case nobody believes me. September 30th. My 16-year-old son had been building a case alone in secret without telling me, without asking for help, because he had watched me take everyone else and Oppo's word over his often enough that he and Oppo's stopped believing I would take his word at all. I set the phone face down on the counter and put both hands on the edge of the sink, and breathed until the thing in my chest turned from something that would take the house apart into something I could carry. I had the notebook. I had the phone. I had a note from a refrigerator and a breakfast conversation from months ago that had already torn something open in me that had never fully closed. The next step was numbers because I have lived my whole working life by numbers, and numbers read correctly do not lie. I drove to First Palmetto Bank on Bay Street at 10:30 that morning and asked Renee, the branch manager who had processed my deposits for 11 years, for 2 years of statements on every account tied to my social security number. She printed 9 pages without asking why. 11 years of business earns a person that kind of courtesy. I spread the pages across the passenger seat of my truck, the same seat where I keep my logbook, the same seat where, the following week, a lawyer would spread out documents that would end a marriage and begin 3 separate criminal cases. And I took out the blue pen I use for route markings and I read every line. The first 14 months were clean. Ordinary household expenses. Then, 9 months after the wedding, a transfer appeared. $900 to an account number I didn't in Oppo's recognize. I kept reading. 1100.950. 800 again. The amounts varied, the pattern didn't and Oppo's. Irregular, unhurried, and never, not once in 22 months, over $1,150. I knew enough about federal banking law to understand why. Financial institutions are required to file a currency transaction report on cash movements above $10,000. But banks also flag unusual patterns of smaller transfers. A practice called structuring, designed to stay just beneath the automatic review threshold. Whoever had built this schedule knew exactly where that line sat and had built the entire operation around staying under it by a comfortable margin. That was not Victor. Victor was not precise enough for something this exact. This was Pauline. I circled every transfer in blue ink and added the column twice to be sure. $41,600. 22 months. I sat in that parking lot and did the math I and Oppo's been avoiding since I opened the notebook. $41,000 is roughly 82 long-haul runs. 82 times I set an alarm for 4 in the morning and kissed my son on the top of his head while he was still half asleep and told him I and Oppo's call that night. 82 times I heard from a rest stop somewhere in Virginia or Georgia, everything and Oppo's fine here, Don and Oppo's worry about us, while my son ate dinner off the floor, stayed away and folded laundry alone past midnight. I folded the statements along their creases, put them with the notebook and the logbook in my jacket, and drove to the end of Cobblestone Court to the Alvarez house, because Rosa Alvarez had lived next door to us for 19 years and had known David before she and Apos D known me, and because something in the careful way she and Apos D started avoiding my eyes at the mailbox over the past few months told me she had something to say she hadn't, and Apos T found the nerve to bring to my door. Rosa opened the door before my second knock, like she and Apos D been waiting behind it. Her husband Manny was already at the kitchen table, coffee made, 2 mugs set out. The specific readiness of people who had rehearsed this conversation many times in their heads without ever finding the courage to start it. And quote, "How long have you two been waiting for me to knock?" And quote, I asked. Rosa and Apos S eyes went wet at the corners immediately. And quote, "Too long," and quote, she said. And quote, "Way too long." And quote. Manny put both hands flat on the table, a man about to say something he and Apos D rehearsed. And quote, "I need to say this before anything else. I thought about coming to your door probably a dozen times this year." Rosa kept saying it wasn't and Apos T our place, that we shouldn't and Apos T get between a woman and her family, and quote. And quote, "I did say that," and quote, Rosa said quietly. And quote, "I was wrong. I and Apos V decided I was wrong." And quote. And quote, "What do you have?" and quote, I said. Manny reached into the drawer beside the stove and slid a manila envelope across the table. And quote, "I started keeping track in February," and quote, he said. And quote, Rosa thought I was being nosy. I told her I spent 30 years as a claims adjuster. I know what evidence looks like, and I know what it and Apos S for. And quote, 41 photographs, each one dated in careful blue ink on the back. Eli taking out the trash in full darkness, the porch camera, and Apos S timestamp reading 4:41 a.m. Eli sitting alone on the back steps with a bowl balanced on his knees while 5 silhouettes were visible around the lit kitchen table behind him. Eli in a short-sleeve shirt on a morning cold enough that Manny and Apos S own breath fogged in the frame. I went through them slowly, keeping my hands steady by force of will, until I turned one over that stopped me completely. Eli standing outside the kitchen window, forehead pressed to the glass, looking in on a table with a cake, candles lit, Pauline and Apos S hands raised mid-clap, Tyler grinning with a fork. On the back in Manny and Apos S handwriting. October 12th, the boy and Apos S birthday. And quote, "They had his birthday cake," and quote, I said. My voice came from somewhere outside my own body. And quote, "Without him," and quote. And quote. "He stood there 4 minutes and 6 seconds," and quote, Manny said quietly. And quote. I timed it on the porch camera. Then he sat down on the steps. And quote. Rosa and Apos S voice cracked apart. And quote. I brought him a plate of tamales that same night. It was all I had ready. He took it and said, "And Apos, thank you ma," and Apos, "Am," and Apos like I, and Apos D given him something enormous. And quote, her shoulders started to shake. And quote. He thanked me for tamales the way a child thanks somebody for the first kindness he and Apos S seen in months. Because that and Apos S exactly what it was. And quote. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. And quote, "This is not your fault. Either of you. You hear me?" And quote. And quote, "We should have come sooner," and quote, Manny said, his jaw working hard. And quote, "You came," and quote, I said. And quote, "You and Apos re here now. That and Apos S what I need." And quote. I drove home 20 minutes later with 41 photographs, 9 pages of bank statements, a black notebook naming 8 targets, and the specific focused clarity of a woman who has finished being confused about what happened to her, and is ready to do something about it. I called my brother-in-law Marcus that night, because Marcus had spent 11 years as a paralegal before going back to school for his own law degree, specializing, by a stroke of luck I will never stop being grateful for, in family law and financial fraud. He listened to everything without a single interruption. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. And quote, "Eli, is he safe right now?" And quote. And quote, "He and Apos S been with me every night since I got home. He hasn't, and Apos T been left alone with any of them," and quote. And quote, "Good. Don and Apos T touch anything else. Don and Apos T confront anyone. I and Apos L'll be there by 7 tomorrow morning." And quote. Marcus arrived with his laptop and a legal pad and went through everything the way a good mechanic goes through an engine systematically, without wasted motion. The bank statements first, every line. The notebook twice. The 41 photographs front and back. The video watched twice. End quote. Pauline built the financial architecture, end quote. I said before he could ask. End quote. Denise and Victor aren't and oppose. T precise enough for subthreshold structuring like this. That and oppose. S Pauline and oppose. S handwriting in the notebook. End quote. He nodded once. End quote. Rena, I have to tell you something you and oppose. Re not going to want to hear before I tell you the plan. If you confront them yourself, move any of this evidence without a documented chain of custody, or go around the legal process in any way, the story stops being about what they did. It becomes about what you did. What you touched when, whether you had the right. End quote. End quote. I and oppose. We been driving this road 31 years, end quote, I said. End quote. I know the difference between flooring it and burning the engine down. End quote. He filed an emergency motion that morning to freeze the joint accounts and the secondary transfer account. Under South Carolina law, documented evidence of ongoing financial fraud qualifies for emergency injunctive relief. A judge can freeze assets without advance notice to the other party if the harm is active and provable. Here is where I have to tell you about the part that didn't and oppose. T goes smoothly because I think it matters, and because I think stories that make every step look effortless do a disservice to anyone who and oppose. S actually lived through something like this. The judge assigned to the emergency motion, not the one Marcus expected, a substitute covering an unusually full docket, pushed back hard on the notebook as the centerpiece of probable cause. End quote. A list of names with a checkmark next to one of them is not, on its own, evidence of a crime, end quote. He said according to Marcus and Oppo's account of the hearing. End quote. I need to see this tied directly to Mrs. Cole and Oppo's accounts before I and Oppo's LL sign an emergency order that could freeze a family and Oppo's day-to-day finances without warning, end quote. We had one day. Marcus spent that night. I sat across from him at my kitchen table until nearly 3 in the morning, remapping every single transfer on the bank statements against dates in the notebook, cross-referencing them against a receipt from a private mailbox service Pauline had rented under a name that turned out to be her maiden name, which Marcus found only because I remembered at 1 in the morning that Pauline had once mentioned in passing, end quote, keeping some old mail, end quote, at a UPS store on Highway 15. That single detail, a stray comment I and Oppo's nearly forgotten, filed away by instinct rather than intention, turned out to be the thread that connected the transfer account directly to Pauline and Oppo's control. The judge signed the amended motion at 4 the next afternoon. I want that setback on the record because it would have been easy for the story to skip it, and because the truth is that doing this right took one more night of exhausted, meticulous work than any of us expected, and that night mattered. End quote. She and Oppo's LL find out when her card gets declined, end quote. Marcus said when he called to tell me it was done. End quote. The accounts are frozen. The transfer account and Oppo's been flagged for the State Financial Crimes Division, end quote. That evening I sat down with Eli after dinner and asked him gently if he and Oppo's be willing to write down what had happened to him over the past 14 months. Not everything, just the pattern, in his own words. He wrote for almost an hour. 4 pages in handwriting that started shaky and steadied by the end, without a single note of self-pity in it. Reading it afterward remains one of the hardest things I have ever done as a mother. They were at a beach rental in Hilton Head when the accounts froze, and it took 2 more days for the household to come home, 2 days during which Denise and Oppo's card got declined at a gas station, and according to text messages Eli later showed us, she and Oppo's blamed it on, end quote, some bank glitch, end quote, in the family group chat, unaware that a state investigator had already opened a file with her name in it. They pulled into the driveway on a Sunday afternoon. Victor was out of the car before it had fully stopped, and Pauline came up the walk in the loose-limbed, sun-warmed posture of someone returning from a week of being looked after and expecting that to continue straight through the front door. End quote. Baby, end quote. Victor said, arms already opening. End quote. What are you doing home early? End quote. End quote. Come inside, end quote, I said. End quote. All of you. End quote. Something crossed his face. Fast, involuntary, gone in under a second, a calculation I don and oppose. T think he meant for me to see. Marcus stood up from the kitchen table when they walked in, with the particular stillness of a man who doesn't and oppose. T need volume to occupy a room. And quote, Mrs. Marsh and quote. He said to Pauline and quote, Mr. Marsh. I and oppose. Am Marcus Whitfield representing Renata Cole. This and quote. He set the first document flat on the table, and quote, is a signed order freezing all joint and secondary transfer accounts, effective as of Thursday. You do not have access to those funds pending further order and quote. Pauline and oppose. S face didn't and oppose. T moved for a long moment. Then Marcus set the black notebook down in the center of the table, and the room changed entirely. I watched Pauline look at that notebook the way a person looks at something they buried deep and built a life on top of. Her hand went to her throat, involuntary. The reach of someone checking for something that used to be there. And quote, where did you find that and quote, she said. Not a question. Her voice had dropped beneath every layer she and oppose. D spent years constructing, the church warmth, the grandmotherly patience, the woman who remembered exactly how you took your coffee. What was left underneath was something flat and assessing, looking at me across her own hunting log the way she and oppose. D once looked at me across a Rotary Club drink table. And quote, left suitcase and quote, I said. And quote, under the envelope, and quote, I see and quote, she said. And quote, I know you do. And quote, Victor and oppose. S voice cracked open. And quote, Rena, please 5 minutes I can explain and quote. Walk them through the rest and quote. I told Marcus and I went out to the front porch where Priscilla, who had driven over the moment I called her that morning, handed me a coffee without a word. Black, no sugar. Through the door I could hear Marcus and oppose. S level voice moving through the paperwork, Denise and oppose. S voice going high and fast, Victor asking eventually for a lawyer of his own. And quote, how do you feel? And quote, Priscilla asked. I looked at the maple tree in the front yard. The ordinary Sunday light moving through the leaves. And quote, like I just set down a load I and oppose. V been carrying a long time and quote, I said and quote, and I can finally feel my back again. And quote, Part 14 what Denise gave us. Denise called Marcus and oppose. S office at 9 that night. And quote, I want to cooperate and quote, she said, her voice tight and fast, the voice of someone who has spent hours sitting with a decision and needs to say it before she loses her nerve. And quote, I need to know what that means for me first. And quote, cooperation gets disclosed to the district attorney before any charging decision, and quote, Marcus told her. And quote, that and oppose s not immunity. But it is documented and it matters. Do you understand? And quote. A long pause. And quote, yes. And quote. Denise walked into Marcus and oppose. S temporary office at 9 the next morning with a public defender half a step behind her, and she talked for almost 4 hours without stopping. She gave us the full rotation schedule, who handled which part of Eli and oppose, S daily treatment, how the house reset itself in the 4 minutes it took a truck to pull into the driveway and its driver to reach the front door, the entire financial architecture, transfer account numbers going back 22 months, and the identity of the person who had set the structuring threshold at $1,150. Pauline, alone at a kitchen table with a calculator and a notebook the same way another woman might plan a family budget. She also gave us 3 more names. Miriam Ostrowski in Charleston, already in the notebook. A woman named Dolores Fenn in Augusta, Georgia, 80 years old, widowed, whose daughter had filed a complaint 2 years earlier over a sudden change to her mother and oppose. S will that had been dismissed for lack of corroborating, and a 4th name Pauline had never entered into the notebook itself, apparently because the operation there had stalled before it reached the stage worth documenting. A retired schoolteacher in Florence who, according to Denise, had grown suspicious after 6 months and asked them to leave. And quote, Pauline compartmentalizes and quote, Denise said. And quote, none of us ever had the whole picture. I only knew my piece. And quote, I am not going to walk you through every hearing because court moves at its own pace, deliberate, procedural, entirely unmoved by how badly anyone needs it to hurry, and because the value in this part of the story I sen and oppose, T in the drama of the courtroom it and oppose, S in what got resolved and what it cost to resolve it. Denise received probation and 200 hours of community service in exchange for her cooperation. She moved to Tennessee that following spring. I Don and Oppose. T know much else about her life now and I and Oppose. V found to my own surprise that I Don and Oppose. T need to. Victor pleaded to a lesser charge of financial exploitation and served 14 months at a minimum security facility. He did not contest the marriage annulment. Under South Carolina law, an annulment, as opposed to a divorce, means the court finds the marriage void from its inception due to fraudulent inducement. Legally, it is treated as though it never occurred. End quote. Like it never happened, end quote. I said to Marcus in the parking lot after that hearing. End quote. Legally, end quote. He said, end quote. Exactly like it never happened, end quote. End quote. Good, end quote, I said and meant it more than I expected to. Tyler was placed with a great-aunt in Ohio. He was 15. I have thought about him more than I expected to in the year since because I Don and Oppose. T believe a 15-year-old builds cruelty like that from nothing. I believe he was handed it before he was old enough to know he and Oppose. D been handed anything at all, the way some children are handed a family trait instead of a choice. I Don and Oppose. T think forgiveness is mine to offer on my son and Oppose's behalf. But I and Oppose. V held a small deliberate space open for the possibility that what and Oppose's taught that young can still, sometimes, be untaught. Pauline stood before judges in 3 states over the course of that year. In Charleston, Miriam Ostrowski sat in the front row of the gallery beside her granddaughter for every day of testimony, clutching her purse with both hands, watching with the focused attention of a woman who had spent 2 years being quietly afraid she and Oppose imagined the whole thing. In Georgia, Dolores Fenn and Oppose's daughter stood at the podium during the victim impact portion of sentencing and read a statement in a voice that did not waver once from the first word to the last. In South Carolina, Marcus read Eli and Oppose's 4 handwritten pages into the record himself, in the same measured voice he used for everything because Eli, 16 years old, and asked whether he wanted to be in the room, had thought about it for a long minute and said no, he didn't and Oppose. T need to be present to be heard. Pauline was convicted on 22 counts across the 3 states. Forgery, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, criminal conspiracy, and because a pattern across multiple states involving a shared method and shared victims, meets the legal threshold racketeering. At sentencing, the judge set down his pen, looked at her over his reading glasses and said, end quote, you treated other people and Oppose's trust as a renewable resource, Mrs. Marsh. It is not. End quote, 16 years. The court also ordered restitution. It took another 11 months to work through the actual mechanics of recovering funds from accounts Pauline had scattered across 4 states. But by the following winter, $38,000 of the $41,600 taken from our household had been returned, along with partial restitution ordered. Though not yet fully collected, Marcus was careful to tell me, for Miriam Ostrowski and Dolores Fenn. End quote, it won and Oppose. T ever be the whole amount, end quote, he told me. End quote, it rarely is. But it and Oppose's real money and it and Oppose's documented and that matters more than people think it does. End quote. Miriam Ostrowski and Oppose's granddaughter called me the week after the Charleston sentencing, a call I hadn't and Oppose's T expected and will not forget. End quote. She wanted me to tell you thank you, end quote, she said. End quote, she said she and Oppose's D spent 2 years terrified she and Oppose's D made the whole thing up in her head, that nobody would ever believe an old woman over a woman who brought her groceries and remembered her birthday, end quote. A pause, her voice going rougher. End quote, she said, I wrote this down so I and Oppose D get it right, she said, tell her I finally believe I wasn't and Oppose T losing my mind, end quote. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment after that call ended, in the cab of my truck, and I let myself cry for the first time since the night I and Oppose D found my son folding towels alone at midnight. We repainted the kitchen that spring. A blue-gray Eli picked out over 2 evenings of paint swatches spread across the table, a color he named, with total confidence, end quote, morning fog, end quote. End quote, you and Oppose re-sure? End quote, I asked, holding the swatch up against the wall. End quote, it and Oppose our house, end quote, he said. End quote, we get to make it whatever we want. End quote. Priscilla brought sandwiches on the Saturday we painted and a full pot of soup on Sunday, unasked. Manny sat in a lawn chair in the backyard and offered opinions on trim color that nobody had requested and everybody, including me, appreciated anyway. Rosa hugged Eli so hard on the second day that he laughed, a real laugh, the first one I and Apo's D heard out of him in longer than I wanted to count, and told her she was going to break a rib. At the end of that second day, Eli stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the finished walls, drying his hands on a paint rag, the late light coming through the window over the sink catching the color exactly right. And quote, Dad would and Apo's V like this and quote, he said. My voice went rough at the edges and I let it. And quote, yeah and quote, I said. And quote, he really would and Apo's V. End quote. Eli and Apo's 17th birthday fell 3 weeks after we finished the kitchen. I had been carrying his father and Apo's compass in my jacket pocket, the same pocket where I carry my logbook, the pocket closest to where I keep things that need to stay safe. Every day since the night I found it untouched, still in my jewelry box where it had waited the whole time, because whatever else Pauline had taken from this house, she had never found the one thing that mattered most. I made eggs the way David used to make them, scrambled with cheddar and scallion, in the dark before anyone else was awake, because some mornings you want to fill a house with the smell of something good before there and Apo's anyone up to ask you why. Marcus and his wife arrived at 8. Manny and Rosa came 10 minutes behind them, Rosa carrying a coffee cake that smelled like every good thing that had ever happened in that kitchen. Eli came downstairs in socks and a sweatshirt, hair in 3 directions, and stopped at the bottom of the stairs at the sight of a full kitchen. And quote, what is this? And quote, sit down before the eggs get cold and quote. Manny told him from his chair, already settled in with an opinion about something. Something moved across my son and Apo's face that I know I will carry for the rest of my life. He pulled out his chair, the one that had been his since he was old enough to sit at a table, and sat down in it the way a person sits down in something they and Apo's been waiting a long time to be allowed to do again. And quote, this is what it and Apo's supposed to look like and quote, he said quietly. Rosa reached over and squeezed his hand hard enough to whiten her own knuckles. And quote, yes baby and quote, she said. And quote, it is. And quote. After breakfast, once the kitchen had emptied out to the porch and the yard, I asked him to stay a minute. I reached into my jacket, into the pocket where I keep the things that matter, and set the compass on the table between us. And quote, your father wanted you to have this when you were ready, and quote, I said. And quote, he didn't and Apo's tell me how I and Apo's know. But I know. And quote, Eli picked it up. His thumb found the catch without hesitation, the way fingers find things they and Apo's this somehow always known the shape of, and he opened it. For our boy Dad. Engraved on the inside of the lid, worn soft with 30 years of handling. He made a sound I and Apo's am not going to try to describe, and he pressed the compass against his chest and bent forward over the table, and his whole body shook with it. I got up and came around and put my hand flat against his back and left it there. And quote, he said to tell you and quote, I said my own voice barely functioning and quote, that a compass doesn't and Apo's tell you where to go. It just tells you the truth about where you and Apo's standing. That and Apo's all you and Apo's I'll ever need from it. And quote. And quote, they tried to take that and quote. He said finally, wiping his face with both palms, David and Apo's exact gesture, the practical refusal to let tears have the last word. And quote. The truth about where I was standing. They tried to take it and make me believe something else instead. And quote. And quote, they tried and quote, I said. And quote, they didn't and Apo's keep it. Came home. Like everything that, end quote. He was quiet for a while, turning the compass over in his hands. And quote, I and Apo's am going to carry it and quote, he said. And quote, not every day. On the days that count. And quote. And quote, that and Apo's exactly right and quote, I told him. An hour later, everyone was loading up to head home, and I went out to move my truck out of the driveway so Marcus could get his car out. I climbed in, started the engine, 31 years of habit, checked the mirrors before you move, and looked in the rearview. Eli was on the porch in socks and his sweatshirt, And he raised one hand. A slow wave, unhurried, deliberate, the exact gesture his father used to make from that same spot every single morning I pulled out for a run, for 20 years, without either of us ever discussing why it mattered so much that we do it. I turned the engine off, got out, walked back up the driveway, and quote, "Forget something?" End quote. Eli asked. End quote. Yeah, end quote, I said. End quote. I forgot I don't and oppose. Actually have anywhere I need to be right now. End quote. He moved over on the step to make room. I sat down beside him. The October light came through the maple the way it does in the low country in the fall, gold, unhurried, not apologizing for being exactly what it is. Neither one of us said anything for a long while. Neither one of us needed to. Epilogue. What I and oppose. Tell you if you and oppose. Still reading. Eli is a senior now. He eats lunch at a table with 4 friends who text him back within minutes if he goes quiet for more than a day, because I made sure, quietly, that at least one of them knew to notice. He fixed another kid and Oppo's bike last month unasked the way he and Oppo's always done, and this time nobody destroyed it in the driveway the next morning. Rosa and Manny come for dinner most Sundays. Priscilla still nags me about sitting home alone too much, though these days it and Oppo's mostly a joke between us, because these days the house is rarely quiet enough for loneliness to find a foothold in it. I still drive. I probably always will. It and Oppo's the only trade I and Oppo's ever known, and I and Oppo's made a kind of peace with what it costs and what it gives in a way I hadn't and Oppo's fully managed before all of this. But I check my mirrors longer now before I pull out. I wait for the wave. I and Oppo's learned the hard way that the habit of waiting for someone on a porch is not a small thing, and that a house can go quiet in a way that means nothing at all or quiet in a way that means everything, and that the only way to tell the difference is to have already trained yourself over years to notice. If there is one thing I would want anyone hearing this story to take from it, it is this: quiet is not the same as fine. A note on the refrigerator is not the same as a phone call. A child who says I and Oppo's got it handled in a voice gone flat is telling you something, whether or not the words themselves sound like trouble. I was not a bad mother. I want to say that plainly because I think stories like this one too often let shame do work that shame has no right to do. I was a tired woman who had lost her husband and was doing the best she knew how with the tools she had. And I was up against people who had spent years perfecting exactly how to be believed over a 15-year-old boy telling the truth. But I came home in time. Not because I was perfect. Because I finally, on one ordinary Tuesday night, let an 11-hour accident of scheduling do what 18 months of instinct alone hadn't and Oppo's yet let me do. I stopped and I looked and I let myself see what was actually in front of me instead of what I needed it to be. That and Oppo's the whole of it really. Not perfect vigilance. Just eventually enough. If this story is familiar to you, if some piece of it sits too close to something in your own house, I hope you don't and Oppo's wait for an accident of scheduling to do the work that noticing could do sooner. Watch the chair at the end of the table. Watch the child who says I and Oppo's am fine in the voice that means the opposite. It is never too late to open the trailer and check the count yourself. It is always worth doing before you sign.